Hey guys, I'm just going to hold the mic because it won't hold on to my shirt. So I'm back again. I'm almost done with this baby quilt of mine that I'm working on. And I'm actually using a pattern from Eleanor Burns Quilt in a Day that I got at a thrift store for $1. And then decided as I was cutting it out that having made kite shapes before, I realized kites look really stunning when they're on point. So after making the block, I turned it on its side, and sure enough, absolutely loved how it looked. And you guys are going to see me pulling some faces today because my granddaughter watched a video and said to me, "Why do you look so angry?" So I told her that's because Grandma has resting crabby face. And so I'm consciously trying to overcome that. So I have the low volume background that I love. You guys know I love that. Any scrappy stuff I love. And this I'm really loving with the low volume backgrounds. I'm using up charm squares that just were part of this one, this package and that package, and I threw them all together and I feel like they work well together. So that's what I'm doing with this. And I've figured out how to make this top one, and I made one for the bottom, and now I just need the two sides to fill in. I believe I'm going to put lattice in them, and that will be it. And then I'll just probably put like a 3-inch border around it and call it a baby quilt and be done with it. So that's where I am with that. And so what I thought I would do is on the small 4.5-inch ruler, and then I actually, by the way, was using my large 18.5-inch Creative Grids ruler to trim the long edge of those triangles on the sides along the edge. So if you want to make one like this, have those two rulers, or use whatever you normally use. But those are the two rulers. If you're going to be using acrylic rulers, that's what I needed. And so I took a couple of pictures of the blocks at various stages. And so now I'm going to go ahead and segue into some areas on the blocks when you're using the ruler. What you want to do is find spots in that block, key points that you want to line up so that when you're cutting it, you're going to get a 4.5-inch aligned block the correct way. So another thing you can do is get some really, you know how we all have some really ugly fabric you don't ever intend on using in a quilt because it's just, you don't know what you were thinking. Just grab some of that and you make yourself a trial block, because that way when you're done and you realize, oh, I made this mistake or whatever, you will not mind just throwing it in the bag to go to fill a dog bed. So that is one way to avoid the hurt that comes from when you throw that blade up the side of the ruler and realized you miscut. So anyway, okay, let's go ahead and watch that. So once you finish sewing your 4.5-inch blocks and you're ready to trim them to 4.5 inches, you're going to primarily be doing two things. First, you're going to be lining up your diagonal line that cuts across diagonally on your ruler. And you're also going to want your seam allowances to fall in some areas on a specific marking point. So when you lay down that diagonal line on the ruler from tip to tip, you're going to be hoping to have you're going to place the narrower part of the kite, that point to the bottom left, put your ruler down on it, and you're going to want to see that the 1/4-inch intersection falls just a hair below the tip of the point of that narrow section of the kite. You need to do that so that when you later on go to sew this into the patchwork and then you attempt to press it flat, you have to allow an extra few threads of fabric so that you can fold that fabric and press it and have it lay relatively flat, because where all your points meet is going to be an abundance of fabric there. So allow yourself that tiny little margin to fit everything in. Once you have the narrow point of your kite down nestled into where the 1/4 inch seam on the left and right intersect, then make sure that the other end of the diagonal line is now pointing straight at the top tip of your kite. Once you have that completely settled, then look to see that the 1/4 inch seams are also meeting at a certain point on your piece. Now, for me, in this particular case, that last point that I needed to check was a 2 to 2 1/8 inch length from the tip of the short end of the kite down to that first 2.5 inch square. So all those landmarks on your ruler, when you have them all in place, you can go ahead and start trimming. And the truth is that when people devise the rulers that they sell you, they're making the ruler based on another ruler's dimension, but they're just not putting all the markings on it. But it is, if you take that acrylic ruler and lay it on top of another ruler that has all the inch and 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch markings on it, you're going to see that the landmarks are all landing in the same spot. So you're just looking to find those landmarks so that you can cut your seam allowances and trim up your blocks so that they wind up being at the 4.5 inch and that the seam allowances line up where they belong in your quilt. Another tip is if you consistently place the narrow end of the kite on the bottom left and the short end of the kite up to the top right, and do your first trim on your two sides then, and then turn it, and then trim the other two sides second, because of the fact that you're trying to look with your eyes to see these landmarks and you don't want to make a mistake. I can say that for me, I have found by starting out with the narrow tip of the kite to the bottom left the first time, turning and then placing the ruler, finding my landmarks, and trimming again consistently each time, I'm less likely to make mistakes. So those are my tips for being able to substitute the rulers you have and make them do double duty rather than having to go out and spend money on more rulers.